A cruel curse. 3 daughters born beneath a wealthy roof, condemned as shame and sentenced to death with their very first breath. Imagine that the moment of life twisted into a mark of disgrace. A young mother fled into the snow carrying those newborn girls, hunted not by strangers, but by the very family that should have protected her. And here's the secret the powerful tried to bury. Within those fragile cries lay the one truth that could burn their empire to the ground. Stay with me just one more minute, and I'll tell you what happened when fire, betrayal, and the courage of a broken cowboy collided with destiny. If stories like this stir your heart, share in the comments how it makes you feel, and may your day be filled with peace, strength, and a little more hope than yesterday. The storm swallowed everything. Wind howled through the canyon as if the earth itself were crying out, dragging curtains of snow across the night until the land vanished into a blur of white and gray. Pines bent beneath their burden, their branches groaning, their shadows stretching like broken fingers. In the distance, the town of Dry Creek was little more than a smear of lantern glow, its weak lights quivering like frightened eyes. Out here there was no warmth, no safety, only the storm, alive and merciless. Through this chaos came Elias Mercer. He rode hunched against the gale, his tall frame stooped by both weather and years. Elias was 55, his beard silvered and stiff with frost, his skin scored by sun and time. The cold clung to him, but it could not match the weight of silence that had followed him for decades. His eyes, blue-gray, sharp yet hollow, searched the storm as though expecting it to take something more from him. His mount, a black gelding named Bramble, pushed through the drifts with labored strength. Each exhale from the horse rose like smoke, vanishing instantly into the swirling dark. Elias leaned forward, patting the animal's neck, whispering words that were as much for himself as for the horse. "Steady now, boy. We've gone through worse. Keep moving." Elias had lived many winters alone. Once he had a wife, Miriam, and dreams of a family, but both had been buried in the same grave. She had died giving birth, and the baby with her, leaving Elias with nothing but a cabin emptied of laughter. Since then, he had ridden the high plains and the canyons as if chasing ghosts, as if daring God to take what little remained of him. Some nights he wondered if his survival was stubbornness or punishment. Tonight, though, the storm carried something new. At first, he thought the sound was a trick of the wind, a high, fragile note, then another. Elias reined Bramble to a halt, tilting his head into the gale. There it was again, not the scream of wood or the shriek of snow across rock. A cry. Thin. Humans. His pulse quickened. He spurred Bramble forward, guiding him toward the canyon's narrow throat. The horse plunged, snow flying, until the canyon opened into a hollow. There, pressed against the stone, was a figure half swallowed by snow. A woman. She was slumped on her side, arms clenched around 3 small bundles. Her chestnut hair was matted with ice, her lips cracked and bloodied, and her green eyes burned fever bright, darting toward Elias with the wildness of prey cornered by a hunter. Blood stained the shoulder of her dress, the crimson already darkening in the cold. Elias dismounted in a rush. "Ma'am, hold still." She flinched away, clutching the bundles tighter. Then one of them stirred, releasing a frail, mewling cry. Elias froze, stunned. Babies. He knelt, dragging off a glove, showing his empty hand. His voice dropped into the low, steady tone he once used to calm skittish colts. "Name's Elias Mercer. I don't mean to harm you, but if you stay here, the cold will take you and those little ones before the sun rises." The woman struggled for breath. Clara Dawson." She shifted her arms just enough to show him the tiny faces pressed against her chest. 3 newborn girls, their skin red from cold, lips trembling with the effort of survival. Lydia, Rose, Hope. The names struck Elias like hammer blows. 3 sparks of life, fragile but defiant. He stripped off his duster and wrapped it around the woman and children, ignoring the claws of wind against his shoulders. As he gathered them to lift onto Bramble, Clara's voice cracked through the storm. "You don't understand. They're coming. They'll kill us." Elias stiffened. "Who?" "My husband's family," she whispered, and the words carried more fear than the storm itself. "Joseph Dawson, banker, powerful. I gave him daughters, not a son. He sent bounty hunters to finish what he wouldn't do himself." The truth hit Elias harder than the wind. He had expected tragedy, perhaps a family lost in the storm, but not betrayal this cruel. A husband's wealth turned into a weapon against his own blood. Bramble shifted nervously, ears pricking. Elias listened, and then he heard it too. The drum of hooves, muffled by snow but growing nearer. Clara's eyes widened, glistening with frozen tears. "They're here." Elias tightened his jaw. "Not yet. They're not." He hoisted Clara and the babies onto Bramble with a strength drawn from desperation. "Hold them close. Whatever happens, don't let go." For an instant, a memory pierced him. Miriam smiling faintly as she reached for the child who never breathed. The ache of it nearly buckled him, but the sight before him, 3 living daughters pressed against Clara's chest, drove him forward. Fate had carved a wound in him once, but tonight it had given him a choice, to save or to abandon. He chose. The rhythm of hooves grew sharper, nearer. Shadows flickered against the snow, torchlight slashing through the blizzard like fiery blades. Elias climbed into the saddle behind Clara, his arms steadying her and the children. He drew Bramble's reins taut, leaning into the storm. His voice was a growl against the wind. "Lord, if you're testing me again, know that I'm not riding alone anymore." Then, through the white chaos, the first torch flared bright, swinging like a sentence passed. Men on horseback poured into the canyon mouth, their shouts muffled but unmistakable. They were closing in, and there would be no turning back. The canyon blazes with sudden firelight as riders pressed through the storm, their torches slicing the snow. Elias, Clara, and the 3 newborns are trapped between the blizzard and the hunters, with nowhere left but forward. The torches had flickered in the storm like vengeful stars, but Elias forced Bramble onward. The gelding lunged through the drifts, hooves pounding against the frozen ground. Wind clawed their faces, but the canyon walls slowly gave way to a path Elias knew, an old hunter's trail leading deeper into the pines. The riders' shouts dulled with distance, swallowed by the storm's throat. At last, when the dark of the trees closed around them, Elias allowed Bramble to slow. Hidden in the timberline stood a cabin, little more than a skeleton of rough-hewn logs leaning against the mountain. Its roof sagged beneath the weight of snow, its door crooked, but it had endured many winters, and tonight it would have to endure again. Elias slid from the saddle, his body aching from cold, and helped Clara and the infants down. Her arms trembled from exhaustion, but she clung to the babies with the strength of fear. "Inside," Elias muttered, shoving the warped door open. A rush of stale air met them, tinged with dust and old smoke. He led them in quickly, shutting the storm outside with a heavy thud. The interior was bare, just a stone hearth, a table missing one leg, and a scattering of broken chairs. Still, it was a shelter. Elias struck flint, coaxing a small flame into dry kindling he kept stashed for emergencies. Soon fire licked the hearth, its glow pushing back the dark. Shadows leapt across the log walls, and for the first time that night, warmth brushed their faces. Clara sank beside the fire, her hair damp with melted frost, her dress torn and stained with blood. She cradled her daughters closer, rocking gently as though the motion alone could keep them alive. Elias crouched near, pulling blankets from a chest in the corner and draping them over her shoulders. "Drink," he said, handing her a tin cup filled with melted snow. Her hands shook as she lifted it. "Thank you." Elias studied her silently. She was younger than he'd guessed, perhaps mid-20s, but her eyes had the weary sharpness of someone who had already faced too many storms. The firelight revealed the gauntness in her cheeks and the bruising along her jaw. After a long moment, Clara spoke, her voice low. "You should have left us." Elias frowned. "I couldn't do that." "You don't understand," she whispered, eyes fixed on the flames. "I'm not some widow abandoned in the snow. I am Clara Dawson, daughter-in-law to Joseph Dawson." The name hit the room like a hammer. Elias stiffened. Dawson was known even in the far reaches of Colorado, a banker whose wealth sprawled across counties, a man whose name opened doors and closed mouths. Clara's voice trembled. "He is powerful, cruel. I gave him granddaughters when he demanded a grandson. To him, to his family, I am a failure. They wanted me gone, wanted them gone." She kissed the damp foreheads of Lydia, Rose, and Hope, her tears streaking lines through the soot on her cheeks. Elias's jaw tightened. The pieces fell into place. "So that's why bounty riders were on your trail." Clara nodded, then reached into the bodice of her dress. Her fingers emerged, clutching a small scrap of folded paper, edges stiff with dried blood. She held it toward him with trembling hands. Elias took it carefully, unfolding it by the firelight. It was a fragment torn from a ledger, the ink smeared but still legible. Numbers, signatures, loans written off under false names. A list of bribes scribbled in the margin. Dawson Bank. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. My husband dropped it the night he struck me. I kept it. I knew it was dangerous, but I could not let it vanish. This proves what they are. Elias stared at the paper, his breath heavy. He had no love for bankers, but this was more than greed. This was a record of crimes, fraud, corruption, the kind that could topple a man like Dawson if it ever reached the right hands. Does anyone else know you have this? Elias asked. Clara shook her head. If they did, we'd already be dead. The fire crackled. Elias folded the paper, slipping it into the inside pocket of his coat. For a moment, silence filled the cabin, broken only by the whimpering of the infants and the storm's muffled roar beyond the walls. He looked at Clara again. Her green eyes were fierce despite her exhaustion, her arms wrapped around her daughters with a resolve that no threat could weaken. In her, Elias saw a mirror of something he thought long-dead defiance in the face of impossible odds. You'll rest here tonight, he said. I'll keep watch. Clara nodded, her lips pressed against Hope's brow. For the first time since he'd found her, her shoulders eased, if only slightly. Hours bled by. The fire rose and fell, shadows shifting like restless spirits. Elias sat near the door, rifle across his knees, his eyes never straying far from Clara and the children. Each soft cry of the babies tugged at something buried in him, something he had tried for years to bury beneath silence. He thought of Miriam again, of her pale hand, of the cradle that had never been filled. Yet instead of grief tearing him apart, there was a strange steadiness inside him now, as though fate, cruel as it had been, had offered him a chance at redemption. Then, as dawn's pale light seeped into the cracks of the cabin, a sudden noise shattered the stillness. A fist, pounding against the door. The sound was harsh, insistent, not the wind, not the storm. Voices followed rough, commanding. Open up. By order of the town, we have a warrant for Clara Dawson. Clara gasped, clutching her daughters tight. The fire hissed as if recoiling. Elias rose slowly, his rifle steady in his hands, his eyes hardening like stone. The door rattled again under another heavy blow. The pounding on the cabin door grew louder, each strike rattling the frail logs as though the storm itself had learned to knock. Elias stood rigid, rifle braced, his eyes narrowing against the voice that shouted through the crack. Open up! By order of the town, we have Clara Dawson's warrant. Clara gasped, clutching her daughters closer, their tiny cries rising like fragile notes against the harsh percussion outside. Her lips formed a silent prayer. Elias, jaw set, motioned her back toward the shadows. The firelight flickered across his lined face, etching determination into every crease. The door finally shuddered open under a forceful push. Snow gusted in, along with a half-dozen men wrapped in thick coats and armed with revolvers. At their head stood a figure Elias recognized immediately, though years had passed. Sheriff Thomas Whitlock. He was broader now, his shoulders carrying the weight of both law and compromise. 52 years old, with graying hair combed neatly under a battered hat, his once warm hazel eyes now held a guarded hardness. His mustache was trimmed sharp, his badge polished bright, as though outward shine could erase the stains of choices made. Once Elias had called him brother-in-arms, before money had swayed his compass. Elias Mercer, Whitlock said, voice firm but edged with something heavier. Step aside. We're here for her. His gaze flicked to Clara, then to the bundles in her arms. Elias did not lower his rifle. And if I don't? The men behind Whitlock shifted, hands brushing their holsters. For a breath, the cabin was filled with the electric silence of men deciding if tonight would spill blood. But Whitlock raised a hand, halting them. He studied Elias with something that almost looked like regret. You've no quarrel in this. Dawson owns half this county. The warrant is signed, sealed. Best you not stand in its way. Clara's voice broke the standstill. Signed by who? By men bought like cattle? Her words cut sharp, her body trembling as she pressed the babies closer. Joseph Dawson wants me erased because I bore him daughters instead of heirs. Whitlock's eyes flickered, a shadow crossing them. He knew it was true. Elias saw the hesitation and pressed. Tom, he said, lowering his rifle just slightly, you and I rode together once. You know Dawson's money can't buy truth. Look at her. Does she look like a criminal or a mother running for her children's lives? The sheriff's jaw tightened. His men shifted uneasily, waiting. Then, with a movement almost imperceptible, Whitlock stepped closer to Elias. His hand brushed Elias's coat as if steadying him, but in that instant, something cold and metallic pressed into Elias's palm. A key. Whitlock's voice lowered, barely audible. In my old storage shed. Far side of town. What you'll find there. It'll speak louder than either of us. Keep it hidden. Before Elias could reply, Whitlock turned sharply to his men. No need to tear the place apart tonight. The storm's bad enough. We'll return at first light. A murmur of confusion rippled through the patrol, but Whitlock silenced it with a glance. Reluctantly, they backed out into the blizzard, lantern light dwindling until only the howling wind remained. The door slammed shut behind them. Elias stood still, the key biting into his palm, his breath clouding in the firelight. Clara's eyes locked onto his, wide with desperate hope. What does it mean? She whispered. He tucked the key deep into his coat. It means there may be proof. Enough to break Dawson's grip, as if to remind them of the fragility they fought for. Lydia stirred and whimpered. Elias leaned closer, adjusting the blanket. That's when he saw a faint mark on the child's shoulder, shaped unmistakably like a crescent moon. Clara noticed his gaze and flinched. Don't, she begged. Her voice cracked. It's nothing. But Elias remembered the whispers that trailed the Dawson family for decades. Tales of a curse that a child born with the moon's mark would unravel the family's power. Most dismissed it as frontier superstition. Yet here, branded into the soft skin of a child, it lived. Does Dawson know? Elias asked quietly. Clara shook her head, tears brimming. If he ever found out, it would seal her fate. She held Lydia tighter, rocking her as though motion alone could erase the mark. Promise me, Elias. No one must know. Elias laid a hand gently on her shoulder. Your secret stays here. But secrets have a way of demanding their own reckoning. The fire sputtered low, embers glowing red. Exhaustion weighed heavy, and for a fleeting moment the cabin seemed a fragile sanctuary. Clara leaned against the wall, her daughters nestled in her arms. Elias sat near the door, rifle across his lap, the key pressing against his chest like a heartbeat. But fate allows no rest. When the storm eased, Elias decided it was time to move. We can't stay here, he said. They'll be back by morning, and next time Whitlock may not be able to hold them off. Clara's face paled, but she nodded. She rose, clutching the children, and followed Elias out into the brittle air. The snow had calmed, leaving the night unnervingly still. Moonlight spilled silver over the forest, turning every branch into a blade. They trudged along the ridge, Bramble carrying Clara and the infants while Elias walked ahead, scanning every shadow. The weight of the key pressed against him, each step reminding him of the truth buried in Whitlock's shed. Then came the ambush. Figures burst from the trees, dark shapes against the snow. Gunfire cracked, echoing through the canyon. Elias spun, rifle raised, firing into the dark. Bramble reared, Clara clutching the children as bullets hissed past. One shot found its mark. Clara cried out, her shoulder jerking back as crimson spread across her dress. She clung to the children with one arm, teeth clenched against the pain. Clara! Elias roared, lunging toward her. He fired again, forcing the attackers back into the shadows. But the damage was done. Blood stained the snow at her feet, bright as a cruel signature. The night fell silent again, save for the ragged breaths of a wounded mother and the crying of her daughters. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle, eyes burning. The burden of secrets had grown heavier, and now blood had been spilled to keep them. Snow still clung to Clara's shoulder where the blood had soaked through, a dark bloom on pale fabric. Elias urged Bramble down the narrow timber path, keeping one hand firm on the reins, the other steadying Clara as she pressed her children close. The night no longer roared with gunfire, but silence pressed down heavier, as though the mountains themselves held their breath. At last, Elias saw it. A sagging shed crouched at the edge of the abandoned mill yard. The structure leaned like a tired sentinel, its roof patched with rusted tin, its planks warped by decades of storms. It was here that Sheriff Whitlock's key had pointed them. Elias slid from the saddle. His boots sank into the snow, crunching loud in the silence. He turned back to Clara. Her face was ghostly pale, sweat slicking her brow despite the cold. Stay here with the girls, he said firmly. I'll be quick. Clara shook her head. No. If this is the proof, I need to see it too. They're after me as much as you. Her eyes were fierce despite the wound, and Elias knew better than to argue. He helped her down, cradling Hope in his arms while Clara balanced Lydia and Rose against her good shoulder. Together, they crossed the yard. The key slid into the lock with a metallic click. The door groaned open, spilling them into stale air thick with dust and rot. Moonlight dribbled through broken slats, casting the interior in stripes of silver and shadow. Inside, crates leaned against the walls. Some split open to reveal stacks of ledgers and files. Moth-eaten coats hung from nails, as if their owners had abandoned them in haste. Elias lit a lantern from his pack, flame shuddering to life. Its glow revealed rows upon rows of journals, names scrawled across cracked spines. He set Hope gently into Clara's arms and began rummaging. Fingers calloused by rope and reins traced faded ink until they landed on one thick volume bound in cracked leather. The front bore a single word etched deep: Dawson. Elias's jaw tightened. He carried it to the lantern light and opened it. Pages upon pages spilled secrets in neat, damning script. Loans laundered through false fronts, payoffs to officials, each signed with trembling hands desperate for Dawson's coin. Names, dozens of them, men who had sworn justice but sold it for silver. Clara's breath caught as she leaned closer. This is enough to bring him down. But Elias's eyes darkened as he flipped further. His hands froze on a page scrawled with a name that hadn't crossed his lips in 30 years. Judge Nathaniel Mercer. His father. Written in Dawson's ledger. A debt marked with an X. A note in the margin. Silenced. Winter of 41. Costly, but necessary. The lantern shook in Elias's grip. He saw it all again. His father collapsing in the courthouse steps. His mother's screams swallowed by the crowd. They had called it an accident, a heart seized by age. Elias had been a boy then, no more than 15, forced into the world alone. He had buried the memory beneath years of dust and whiskey. But here it was, inked in black, Dawson's handwriting branding his father's murder as a line-item expense. Clara touched his arm gently. Elias, what is it? He closed his eyes, the storm inside him greater than any outside. When he opened them, the lantern light burned against the wetness there. Nathaniel Mercer was my father, a judge. Dawson killed him to buy the law, and I've lived every day since wondering why justice never came. Now I know. Clara's lips parted in shock. Then this fight, it isn't just mine. Elias nodded, voice ragged but resolute. No, it's ours, for truth, for your girls, and for every man Dawson has buried beneath ink and lies. For a moment, the shed was silent save for the flutter of the lantern flame. The children stirred softly in Clara's arms, as though the weight of their legacy already pressed upon them. Then, outside, a sound cut through the stillness. A low rumble, the creak of wagon wheels, the crunch of boots. Elias's instincts screamed. He doused the lantern and pulled Clara back into the shadows. Through a crack in the boards he saw them, torches, dozens swaying in the hands of armed men, and at their head rode Joseph Dawson himself. The banker's figure was unmistakable, broad shoulders wrapped in a heavy fur coat, his bearded face ruddy in the firelight. He was older than Elias, remembered close to 60, his once thick hair now gray at the temples, but his eyes glittered with the arrogance of a man who believed the land itself bent at his command. He raised a torch high, his voice booming across the yard. Search every inch. She belongs to me, those children belong to me, and Mercer, his lip curled, Mercer will burn with them. The men roared in reply, scattering with torches. In seconds, flames licked at the mill walls, fire leaping greedily onto dry wood. Smoke billowed, carrying the stench of power unrestrained. Elias pulled Clara close. We have to move. Now but Dawson's voice cut through again, closer, sharper. The cabin is ours. Burn it to the ground. Everything belongs to Dawson. The torches swung. Sparks rained against the shed. Fire roared to life just beyond the door, its heat pressing against the walls like a predator's breath. Elias tightened his hold on the ledger, the secrets within it heavier than iron. The fire was a living beast, its tongue of flame devouring the wooden beams of the cabin. Sparks flew upward like a swarm of furious fireflies carried by the wind into the midnight sky. Smoke rolled thick and black, pressing down on lungs, forcing eyes to water. Inside that inferno, Elias Mercer staggered through the blaze, his shoulders bent beneath two burdens. Clara slumped against his back, pale and gasping from the wound at her shoulder, and in his arms, swaddled against his chest, the three infants who whimpered at every crack of burning timber. Each step was a war against collapsing boards, against heat so fierce it seemed the night itself might melt away. His boots struck the floorboards with desperate force. He could not allow hesitation, not when every breath of smoke threatened to steal Clara's fragile life. Behind him, the roof groaned like an animal in death throes. He pressed onward, shielding the babies with his own chest, his voice hoarse as he shouted, "Hold on, Clara!" Just one more step, just one more breath. Clara stirred faintly, her auburn hair clinging damp to her blood-stained cheek. "Elias," she whispered, barely audible. "The girls. Don't let them go." "I won't," he growled, his jaw set against fear. "Not while I'm breathing." At last, with a violent shove against the cabin door, Elias emerged into the night. Cold air struck him like salvation, though the fire's heat still roared at his back. He staggered onto the snowy ground, knees buckling under the combined weight. Clara slid from his shoulders into the snow, her chest heaving, while the babies wailed in his arms. Around them, the glow of fire painted the white drifts red, as if the mountain itself bled. But no sooner had Elias tasted freedom than the night was torn open by voices harsh, commanding. A line of armed men stepped from the shadows, torches casting long, cruel shapes across the snow. At their front, tall and broad, his silvered hair slicked back beneath a black hat, Joseph Dawson himself appeared. His coat was thick fur, immaculate despite the chaos, his gloved hands clasped behind his back as if this were nothing more than a business transaction. "Mercer," Dawson called out, his voice deep and oily, carrying over the crackling fire. "You've taken what belongs to me. Hand them over. The woman, the girls. Even your own blood can't buy you out of this debt." Elias tightened his grip on the swaddled infants. His body trembled from exhaustion, but his gaze was steady, burning as fiercely as the cabin flames. Clara struggled upright beside him, clutching her wound, and for the first time since her marriage had shattered her life, she faced her husband's father with unflinching defiance. "These children," she said, voice rough but rising, "are not debts, and I am not your possession." Dawson's smile was cold. "You forget yourself, Clara. You forget the law of this town, the law that bends when I command it. 3 daughters bring shame to my house, and your defiance brings ruin to your name." He turned to his men, lifting a hand. "Seize them!" Before the mercenaries could step forward, another figure emerged through the haze, broad-shouldered, coat dusted with ash, badge glinting faintly at his chest. Sheriff Whitlock. His weathered face was streaked with soot, his gray beard singed by fire. His eyes, however, held a light that had been missing for years, as though some final weight had lifted. He raised his rifle high, then lowered it with deliberate calm. "No more, Dawson," Whitlock declared, his voice echoing across the snow. "Not tonight." The mercenaries hesitated. Murmurs rippled among them. Whitlock pulled a leather-bound ledger from beneath his coat, its cover blackened at the edges yet intact. "Your sins are written here," he said, shaking the book so all could see. "Bribes, fraud, murder covered by gold. The whole town will hear it. You no longer own this valley." Gasps carried from the small crowd of townsfolk who had followed the blaze, drawn by the fire and commotion. Joseph Dawson's composure cracked. His gloved hands clenched, his face darkening. "You dare betray me, Whitlock?" The sheriff stood firm. "I've been your dog too long. But even a dog bites back when the master poisons the well." The moment hung, trembling like a bowstring. Then, from the edge of the crowd, Clara pushed herself to her feet. Though her dress was torn, blood marking her sleeve, she stepped forward into the circle of firelight, every eye turned toward her. "Joseph Dawson," she cried, her voice carrying with startling strength. "You may have silenced me in your house, but you cannot silence me before your people. I was your son's wife. You shamed me because I bore daughters, not the son you demanded. You sought to erase me, to erase them. But these girls are flesh and blood, innocent and alive. And I will not let you bury their names beneath your greed." The murmurs grew into shouts of anger, disbelief, support. Dawson's empire, built on fear and silence, began to tremble. He raised his arm as if to strike her, but two mercenaries caught each other's gaze and faltered. The mask was cracking, the fear dissolving in the firelight. Clara's hand, trembling but resolute, pointed at the ledger Whitlock held. "That is your true legacy, Joseph. Lies and blood. Let every man and woman here see what you truly are." The crowd roared. Some shouted for Dawson's arrest, others spat curses into the snow. For the first time, Dawson's command faltered. He snarled, stepping backward, only to find two of Whitlock's deputies closing in. In fury, he reached for a revolver hidden beneath his coat, but Whitlock's rifle was already raised, aimed steady at his chest. "Don't," the sheriff warned, voice sharp as steel. "The law is watching now." Dawson froze, trembling with rage. The revolver slipped from his glove into the snow. Deputies seized him, wrenching his arms behind his back, forcing iron shackles upon his wrists. The crowd erupted, some with cheers, others with gasps. The great Joseph Dawson, master of banks and land, dragged like a common criminal through the ashes of the mountain. Yet in that moment of triumph, the toll of fire and battle struck Elias. His knees gave way, the world spinning as the weight of Clara's rescue, the girl's cries, and his own hidden wounds converged. Blood seeped beneath his shirt, wounds deeper than he had let on. The ground rushed up to meet him as Clara screamed his name. Joseph Dawson was hauled into the darkness, cursing, but Elias Mercer fell to the snow, his breath ragged, his strength spent. The night seemed to close in, flames dying, leaving only the thunder of Clara's voice crying into the cold air. Spring crept slowly across the mountains. The snow that once sealed the valley in silence melted into rivulets, feeding streams that glittered under new light. The forest, blackened at its edges from winter's fire, began to green again. Where ash lay heavy, wildflowers rose stubbornly, fragile yet unyielding. Weeks had passed since the fire, since Joseph Dawson had been shackled and dragged away like a fallen titan. In that time, Elias Mercer hovered between life and death. Bandages wrapped his side and shoulder, wounds carved by smoke, steel, and exhaustion. Clara sat by him day and night, three tiny girls bundled in woven blankets near the hearth of a neighbor's cabin. Elias, gaunt and pale, stared at the ceiling beams one morning when the light streamed through the shutters. His voice was rough but steady as he whispered, "If I'm still here, then I'm meant to build again." Clara touched his hand, fingers thin but warm. Her auburn hair had grown wild around her face, her wound healing slower than she admitted. "You're not alone," she said. "We'll build together. Not for Dawson, not for his name, for ours." By the time Elias could walk without faltering, summer pressed against the valley. With Clara at his side and the help of townsfolk stirred by their defiance, they raised beams on a slope overlooking the wide valley floor. Each plank lifted felt like an act of defiance against years of tyranny. The place soon bore a name whispered with respect to Mercer Ridge. The house was modest at first, a skeleton of logs with tarred shingles, but it faced the sunrise. Elias insisted on that. If the girls wake to light, they'll never doubt morning comes after the longest night. Neighbors came to watch the walls go up. Children laughed while carrying nails in small pails. Old women brought bread. Even Sheriff Whitlock, stripped of his badge but not his dignity, arrived in worn clothes to lay stones for the foundation. His beard had grown longer, his face lined with regret. "A man's past can't be undone," he told Elias quietly. "But maybe it can be outbuilt." When the last wall rose, Claire began opening the door not only to neighbors but to children of the town. Many came barefoot, their cheeks hollow, hands rough from fields. She sat them at long benches, chalk in hand, teaching letters and numbers by the glow of lanterns. One boy of 8, hair pale as straw, hesitated at the threshold. His name was Samuel Carter, an orphan who slept in barns when winter crept too deep. Clara placed chalk in his hand, closing his trembling fingers around it. "Every mark you make here," she told him, "is proof you belong." The room filled with voices, once silent. Children who had been ignored began stringing words into sentences, laughter into songs. Mercer Ridge became more than a house. It became a refuge. Time unfurled, and the three daughters grew from infants into girls who carried distinct sparks. Lydia, the eldest, with coppery hair like her mother, showed fearless resolve. By 5, she was already climbing ridge rocks, standing tall with her chin lifted. When storm swept the valley, she pressed her palms against the glass and whispered, "It cannot break us." Rose, the middle child, quieter but piercingly intelligent, asked questions even the adults stumbled to answer. She studied the account books Elias once guarded, tracing columns with her small finger. "If numbers can hide lies," she murmured, "they can also reveal truth." Hope, the youngest, carried a gentleness that softened even the hardest hands. She was the first to offer bread to Samuel when he lingered after lessons, the first to pat Whitlock's weathered arm when he stood alone at the edge of gatherings. Her smile seemed to remind the town that compassion was not weakness, but strength disguised. The sisters were no longer shadows of shame, as Dawson had branded them. They were fire-forged, each bearing a flame of their own. Elias still bore scars that ached in rain. Sometimes at night, when the house lay quiet, he pressed his palm to his ribs where Dawson's men had cut him. Pain was his reminder, but also his anchor. Clara would find him awake, staring into the dark. "You gave them a future," she would whisper, sliding beside him. "That's what matters now." And Elias would nod, though in his silence he carried the weight of his father's legacy, the judge cut down by Dawson's greed. The ridge was not only his refuge, it was his answer. Seasons turned. Dawson's empire collapsed without its head. The bank crumbled under the ledger's revelations. Debts forgiven, land returned. Farmers tilled their fields with renewed dignity. The town, once caged by fear, began to breathe. It was not perfect. Wounds of mistrust still lingered. But at Mercer Ridge, children carried new words home to their parents, letters tucked into calloused hands. Education became rebellion, and hope became inheritance. One spring morning years later, wildflowers painted the slope in purple and gold. Elias, his hair silver now, leaned against the porch post. Clara stood beside him, her face lined but radiant, her eyes alive with quiet triumph. Before them, the three daughters chased one another across the meadow. Lydia leapt over stones, Rose knelt to gather blossoms, and Hope ran with arms outstretched, laughing as if the valley itself belonged to her. Neighbors watched from below, some with tears, some with smiles, whispering that Dawson's curse had become Dawson's undoing. Elias reached for Clara's hand. Fingers, once scarred and calloused, clasped together as though they had never been parted. He breathed deep, the air no longer thick with ash but sweet with the scent of pine and blossoms. "We lost so much," he said softly, "but look at what we kept. Look at what we made." Clara squeezed his hand, her eyes fixed on their daughters. "This," she whispered, "was always worth the fire." The camera of the mind's eye pulled wide. Mercer Ridge glowing under spring light, children's laughter carried on the wind, the couple hand in hand. The story ended not in ruin, but in the proof that from ashes new foundations rise. In the end, Three Daughters Through the Fire is not only the story of Elias, Clara, and the children they carried through the storm. It is a reminder that the lives once dismissed as burdens can become the very lights that guide us forward. That even in the ashes of betrayal and loss, families can rebuild, stronger, kinder, and rooted in hope. Sometimes the fire does not destroy us. It forges us into who we were meant to be. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your voice. And if you wish to walk with us through more stories of love, courage, and redemption, please subscribe so you'll never miss the journeys yet to come.